The Southern Whale Fishing Company had been sending ships throughout the southern Pacific Ocean in search of whales, more specifically their blubber, which could be used for wax and oil-based products such as candles and lamps. It was the vessel The Ocean, belonging to the Samuel Enderby and Sons Company, that found the Auckland Islands in 1806. The crew of The Ocean promptly claimed the islands as British clay. In years to come, many explorers would make contact with the island, but it was Benjamin Morel, an explorer and trader's account, that would set a new course for the archipelago. He wrote of Auckland's beautiful plains, temperate climate, and arable land that was fit for all non-tropical vegetables and animals. A young Samuel Enderby caught hold of this memoir and became encapsulated with the idea of establishing a whaling station on the island. However, more importantly for him was building a thriving colony. He sent out pamphlets in an attempt to foster interest in those with the necessary skills to establish a self-sufficient settlement. The United Kingdom soon gave a royal decree of charter to the whaling company, and the Auckland Islands were theirs to make profitable. This settlement was to be called Hardwicke, named after the Earls of Hardwicke in England. The beaches are stony. It is summer, but they are freezing. The water is dark. The people who agreed to join the settlement efforts were lied to. The island wasn't the place Enderby and Morel described it to be. They painted an idyllic picture of the island, and yet here they were, shocked and betrayed upon seeing the stark contrast between the harsh reality of the island and the way it was depicted. Enderby knew the islands were inhabited by a Maori tribe, an indigenous people of mainland New Zealand, but decided to keep this a secret so as to not scare the settlers away. Naturally, the members of the first ship were surprised when they were greeted by 3 Maori paddling out on their small boat. There were about 65 natives in total who had lived on another island within the Auckland Island archipelago for about 7 years to date, 40 of whom were Maori. They had with them 25 slaves of a different indigenous group. Later it became known that the Maori had trouble getting settled as well. In less than a decade, over half the natives who attempted to settle on the island had left or died. The reality of the island contrasted with the virtually utopic image proposed. It was a blatant deception. It rained 300 days a year. There were only 10 to 15 hours of sunlight a month, and there were wind gusts with average speeds of 60 kilometers an hour. The soil was not much better. Of the 510 square kilometers, only 5 acres were considered arable, and this included livestock agriculture. It was not at all what Enderby had claimed it to be. Nevertheless, for the time being, they persevered. They planned to establish a permanent settlement on Port Ross, north of the Auckland Island. This area was a natural harbor providing protection from the constant storm-like wind and rain conditions, making it an ideal location for the 40 proposed whaling ships to move throughout efficiently. At the end of 1849, a group of people started constructing the settlement. They struggled with the tangled roots and mud caused by extensive rainfall. By the turn of 1850, William Mackwork, a settler, was appointed Assistant Commissioner of the settlement. He established a court of magistrates and regulated the sale of alcohol. By the end of 1850, the colonists took residence on shore, after spending approximately 6 months aboard the ship due to non-ideal living conditions on the island. Naturally, living on a ship came with living in close quarters and no privacy. The smell was horrible, and their days would have been filled with hard, yet monotonous work, both maintaining the ship and establishing the settlement. The wood they used for the buildings had shrunk and warped under the cold conditions and heavy rainfall, constantly exposing the inhabitants of the settlement to rain. With water dripping through roofs, everything was damp, and mold spreading on walls only exacerbated already present illnesses. They had constructed close to 30 buildings. Enderby's description of the Auckland Islands were further proven distorted, as growing any vegetables was nearly impossible. The food that was able to be grown was lacking in size. Managing livestock was difficult due to the terrain, and the settlement was always low on meat. Perhaps this was a good thing, because the pork was described as having a strong fishy taste due to the pig's diet of seaweed and seal carcass. In 1850, Governor General of the New Zealand colony, Sir George Grey, visited Hardwicke on the HMS Fly. He stayed for multiple days and left pessimistic about the future of the settlement. The frigid conditions on these subantarctic islands were truly horrendous. There were a few marriages, and there were a handful of childbirths. The settlers held picnics, dinner parties, and even boat races. Throughout certain points of the settlement, mostly in the beginning, though briefly, following the construction of the buildings, the morale was described as hopeful. This feeling of hope didn't last long, and morale began to stall. Many of the settlers turned to alcohol. One account in January of 1851 describes 2 drunk men stealing a boat in an attempt to sail to New Zealand to escape. Alas, they had to be saved after wrecking the boat on a nearby island. The settlement's surgeon fell from a small dock due to his drunkenness. This was then followed by violence so extreme he had to be taken to a makeshift jail on a nearby island. This was the only building on the island. The jail was promptly named Rudd's Castle, after the surgeon and perpetrator. Alcoholism became increasingly more common, leading to more people being placed in jail, which was ineffective due to the rain warping the wood that held the inmates within the building's walls. Being accused of quote-unquote spending quality time with the other sailors, the wife of one of the settlement's chiefs attempted to hang herself. Charles, the chief medical officer, was almost shot by his sister, who eventually pointed the gun at herself. 2 months later, they both left for Sydney, Australia. The replacement for the medical doctor swiftly made use of the drugs at his disposal. He was told by Enderby himself that he had to leave or go to jail. He chose the latter. Supply vessels from Australia would bring significant amounts of alcohol with them. The same vessels would often forget to bring sufficient amounts of food, livestock, and shoes, leaving the settlers to use sealskin as footwear. Because of this logistics issue, alcoholism was rampant. A vote was held that sought to ban the consumption of alcohol in Hardwicke. Only 6 of approximately 70 people voted for this ban. On one of the ships, a part of the whaling fleet, there was an outbreak of scurvy and dysentery. At least 1 man died because of the scurvy and dysentery outbreak, but it was believed that his death was due to the actions of the incompetent replacement doctor. The illnesses were too much for the crude infirmary, forcing them to cram together those who were sick. 7 people died in the infirmary. In total, an estimated few dozen people died throughout the existence of the colony. Commemorating the 2 infants who lost their lives, a headstone was carved from a mill wheel, which was never used to crush grain because grain never grew. Rumors of Enderby's idea failing spread. Accordingly, the company dispatched 2 commissioners to assess Hardwicke. The commissioners arrived at the island's port in December of 1851. 30,000 spent, 3,000 earned. All of the houses were disassembled and auctioned off in Sydney, leaving no trace of the colony other than the crude graveyard. The last colonists departed from Hardwicke in August of 1852. The whaling fleet that would endlessly circle the Auckland Island archipelago was described as lackluster. They had 14 ships, which is much less than what was estimated to collect enough whale blubber to make the settlement profitable. The crew was described as incompetent, as the workers were simply inadequately trained. Out of the 16 voyages out of the settlement, the ships harvested about 2,000 barrels of oil, which was simply not enough for the company to continue sponsoring the settlement.